All right. Episode 2. This week is all the different ways you can do headcount planning. Tops down, bottoms up, rolling forecasts, not making a headcount plan at all and just kind of seeing where you land throughout the year. There's a bunch of different strategies you can use. But as we enter Q4, as people are getting rolling in uh, the headcount planning season, we wanted to cover it and kind of, if we're lucky enough to have CEOs and business owners listen to this, like which plan's right for you and why you should do it. But generally, if you're operating in any one of these structures, knowing how they operate and kind of what are things that we can do to make them operate more efficiently. But I think, let's first start off with some definitions. How do you define the different ones? Which one have you been using, internally at Wayfair or other companies? What do you recommend? Let's start with some definitions though. What's top down versus bottoms up versus rolling forecast?
Yeah, and I really like how we're kind of really defining the three main ones. And I think off the top, no one's going to do just one of these, but the weighting that you apply to each of them depends on the success, I think, of your 2026 plan. So the first one, I think most people are familiar with, the top-down one. That's, finance sets the target. So they set your budget and you as a business leader get a number you've got to hit, and that's tied to your P&L. And so then you build your headcount plan based off that. You then got bottoms up. I've seen this become a lot more common, more in technical organizations where the finance team don't necessarily know how many people are needed to deliver the product. So the leaders will then go down to their kind of bottom level managers and try and understand how many people they need for the team in the next year in order to build what their goal is for the business or for the kind of technical roadmap. You've got your top down, your bottoms up. And then the third one, which is, I think my favorite, is the rolling forecast. This is a little bit more complicated, but what you're doing is throughout the year, you're adjusting your plans based on what you're seeing in the business, what you're seeing in the hiring plan, how you're seeing the market react to what you're doing. So it's a lot more accurate, but you're updating the plan kind of on the fly as you go. And what we actually see happen in practice is this is how headcount planning runs on a quarterly basis when you present your P&L to the board and all of a sudden you realize that you're under or overextended. And so you have to kind of go back to the drawing board. So I think understanding the three areas and where you should leverage each of the three, I think is really important off the bat.
Yeah, I think a consistent theme through, I don't know what you've experienced, but I've been in a couple of internal companies where the common thread between all of them is some form of calibration, some form of two people competing over limited budget. And, in a top down, that might be about advocating for the budget that you have once, at the very beginning of the process. In bottoms up, I've been in some nasty calibration meetings where folks are trying to determine the importance of one of their roles versus a peer who they're not necessarily interested in the business that person runs or why their headcount is important. They're more advocating for theirs. And then in the rolling forecast, this might be something that you have to do mid-board meeting, mid-exec meeting as you kind of trend towards or off plan. And so each individual strategy has its own, I want to say the word vibe, but each individual one comes with things that teams need to be aware of in order for it to be successful, in order for it to not kind of erode the culture of the business. What I think's also important is for each type of forecast, how does that affect your Q4s? We're in Q4 right now, October 16th at the time of recording. Recruiting teams are finishing up 2025's plan and getting ready for 2026. So in a top-down or bottoms-up or rolling forecast world, like that has different implications on or I've at least experienced, that has different implications on the recruiting team today. Do you feel that? Do you see that, people are trying to like mash their budget in so they get the same amount of budget for next year, or they're sandbagging roles here? Like, what do you see happening tops down versus bottoms up versus rolling as it relates to like what recruiting teams and budget owners are experiencing today?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think given where I've worked throughout my career, I've seen all of the different kind of variants of how this could actually play out. Actually, kind of government, military type roles, you get a standard budget each year, and if you don't spend the budget, your budget decreases the next year. I think that's more the kind of traditional bureaucratic way of managing this, but it still happens in a lot of organizations. And so in that case, at Q4, if you still got budget left to spend, but you're maybe flogging your recruiting team to try and really close those candidates and get those salaries on the book so that your overall budget doesn't go down year over year. I think most finance and HR leaders understand that this is something that happened in the past, and so we don't really see that so much anymore in a lot of kind of newer high growth companies. But you definitely like have that, and I'm curious if you've seen that from a kind of top down management perspective. But I've also seen it on the other side where I've been bottoms up. I've actually been a manager and owning a team, and all of a sudden I get told, "Oh, you have 3 extra recs for the coming year for roles that I never asked for and never scoped." But the budget's coming down, and so now as a manager, I've got to try and figure out how do I think about growing the team when the market demand for that growth is not necessarily there. It's not kind of as clear cut as you always plan to the objective, but you kind of plan within the constraints that you get given, and how those constraints get outlined, I think is the key decision for the leadership team and the CEO, the CFO, the CHRO, who are getting together and deciding how are we actually going to play this out over the next year? How are we going to take in those demands from the business leaders that are kind of waving the flag? How do we make sure it's not just a squeaky wheel that gets the grease, but the one that's actually going to have the most leverage for the organization in the coming year? I'm curious about your perspective there. See, I've seen many different iterations of this. Have you seen the same?
So I was thinking of something. I have like I would always look at high priority or P0. I think every company has a different way of articulating what is high priority. I have a specific philosophy on it that I've built into the software that I provide, where it's like priority is a percentage of recruiting capacity. Not necessarily, there's no limitation, but if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. And so by tracking what the relationship is of total recs that are high priority in Q4 versus ones that are, what percentage of recs are high priority quarters 1 through 3, it gives you this idea of whether or not there's a kind of finite urgency to the headcount that is coming from either one of these types of plans. I think for businesses that still operate on the use it or lose it philosophy, I would assume there's a high correlation for most businesses of like people trying to rush things through. So the downstream effect of that is the recruiting sentiment. You have recruiter performance reviews coming up. So if managers are very vocal about whether or not their roles are being filled, this is kind of like, unfortunate timing for recruiters. But, that's a stat that I've always taken a look at and said, okay, if I track priorities in Q4 over time, then I'm able to see kind of how these things unlock. So I have that. I have another stat that's about, we'll call it like requisition urgency. So what I've always tried to use as a time to fill and notice period in order to forecast when a recruiter should start a role. So if hiring managers are trying to add a bunch of roles to use up their budget in Q4, we call them expedited requisitions, right? Like you're requesting it, I don't have enough time to fill it. So you want it, I'm not sure based on the numbers I can do it. I think we talked a little bit about this last episode. And for those who are tuning in now for the first time, last episode was all about planning and starting Q4's headcount season. But nonetheless, when you're looking at how many interview hours somebody has, how much capacity your recruiter has, whether or not you have enough time to fill on the role, if people are requesting things that are impossible and then try to hold you accountable for them, and worst case scenario, try to articulate a poor performing recruiter as a result of them, these are things that you should look out for. But do you have any stats or data that you look at as a function of how people are using up Q4's plan? What do you see in either your customers or clients today, or from the businesses that you've served internally? What are you seeing as a function of like this Q4 demand cycle?
Yeah, and I think the kind of like the key thing there, and where you see this work and not work is having a strong TA leader who has that data, has the understanding of their capacity plan, and understands the narrative of what's happening at the end of the fiscal year when, as you say, the leaders are trying to get their recs in, they're trying to get them prioritized, everything becomes top priority. But I think managing that expectation of, well, if you open a role now on October 16th, then there's a 3-month time to fill, you're not getting it before the end of the quarter. No matter what we do, there is you have to put in the work in order to get the product out at the end. I think the danger there, and one of the things I would track quite closely in my role at Wayfair, was time to fill versus quality of hire. And quality of hire is a whole rabbit hole we're probably not going to go down. But when you're thinking about headcount planning, if you're just focusing on how do we get this person in the door as quickly as possible, you're going to take some shortcuts. You're probably not going to make the most optimal decision. And then maybe you're reopening that role 6 months later, when the person you hired doesn't work out, maybe they kind of implode within the organization. And third, leaders at some big tech companies talk about blast radius, when someone that's not a right fit is hired into a role and then destroys the reputation of the leader who hired that person, but also maybe takes some of their peers with them when they inevitably don't work out. So I think what I'd be tracking very closely is, where is the demand actually coming from? What is the actual priority? And is it solely because we're trying to spend the budget before the end of the fiscal year? And, is that actually a finance mandated approach, or is that something we can push back on and open the recs that we need to open, but create a clear timeline showing the priority and the sequencing of those kind of roles, so that you don't then take a hit to quality of hire, and then the recruiting team has to do twice as much work in 2026 because you're having to rehire everyone that was closed in Q4. Definitely seen this in practice. Something I advise a lot of leaders, and to be very clear about their candidate profile before they start the hiring process, and not just, this role's so important, I just need someone in the seat as quickly as I can. Have you seen the same thing? Like, what has been your experience leading TA as in that kind of context?
Well, you brought up a good point. I think you and I both saw the opportunity in having HRIS and ATS and headcount plan data in one place, right? I think most companies do that. They're in a spreadsheet in some way, shape, or form. But when you start correlating data for the things that we're talking about here, so, you call it blast radius, and we both recognize that as quality of hire for Q4 hires. But I think without information from the HRI, your partner teams, such as like a performance rating or tenure of folks hired in a given range, or, number of pips associated with, it depends on, of course, what data you're able to share and put into this lake. But, when you look at what is the correlation between the quality of hire, quality of tenure, length of tenure, revenue performance of the folks that are hired in Q4 to the rest of Q1, Q3, I think this is a good kind of like workforce planning trend to identify by unifying this data into a singular data set. Secondly, when you're looking at attrition from Q4, so we have this report in Headcount called the Capacity Demand Actuals Report. And what it says is, what did the business think you were going to hire in 2026, and then what actually happened? And one of the main variables in what actually happened is the attrition rate. I don't think this is new information for anybody, but being able to correlate Q4 hires and attrition, 90-day attrition, first year voluntary versus non-voluntary attrition. Like, there's just a lot of information that you can glean from this data set that says, for future workforce plans, this is some considerations that I would add so that hopefully we're a little bit more accurate in the way that we in the future. And I think this all culminates to your point about what can a TA leader do, or what can a recruiting leader do in this scenario. So we'll get down to the specific ones. I want to hear your thoughts on bottoms up, tops down, rolling forecasts. Like, they each have different actions for a TA leader in Q4, but all of them have a common theme that you need to be a partner to the business about the relationship between what the business is asking the service of recruiting and what you're capable of providing, so that not only is there a transparency about what's possible, specifically for revenue producing roles, specifically as people try to use their budget, but you're taking partnership with the executive team as like, we're solving this problem together, right? And whether that's, I need to build a pipeline of recs that I know open up in Q4 so that I can shorten my time to fill and maybe keep candidates on hold or whatever, all the way down to, we need to adjust compensation or job levels so that we can use the budget with less hires, et cetera. Being that partner and helping people get to the solution is what your aim should be, rather than telling them, no, we can't do that. Yes, we can't do that. But, we'll start with the rolling forecast. I know that you have a preference to it. I follow you on LinkedIn. If no one is following Chris on LinkedIn, probably the best headcount posts, myself included, I'll give you that credit. I just love all the information. But as a fan of the rolling forecast, right? A talent leader is doing things like setting their capacity for Q4, reporting on the actuals of what's going on. What are things that TA leaders should be doing in a Q4 for the different types of headcount, 2026 headcount planning styles? So, like, starting with the rolling forecast, what should a TA leader be doing?
Yeah, so I think kind of going into the Q4 cycle, I think most TA leaders are probably already sitting down with their C-suite stakeholders and aligning on prioritization of recs, so that when the kind of skip levels come to the head of TA and say, hey, I need this rec prioritized, you actually have the list that's been approved by senior leadership. So that's kind of like the first thing. And that gives you that data to push back on. And then as you're kind of like moving through the season and you can kind of tie time to hire to each of those recs, you can actually start to sequence and say, given the expected time to hire for this role, given the priority of this role, this is when we think we're going to start hiring. This is when we think it's going to close. If that's not going to fit the objective of the business in Q2, then, let's revise. But it's always kind of going back to who is the decision maker and not kind of trying to work around that process. Generally pretty firm on a rolling forecast is staying very aligned with what the senior leadership team want and not kind of getting into the weeds with analysis paralysis where everyone's coming with different demands and actually putting their business case to the head of TA when really the decision maker is not the head of TA, they're the one who's executing. So I think being empowered as a head of TA, I think is going to be really important there. But I think actually going into more of a kind of a rolling forecast is ensuring that you have the accurate data when you need it in order to project forward and understand where is headcount going to be given the current hiring activity, given what we see in the ATS, and given what the attrition forecast is likely to be. I mean, attrition's quite hard to forecast at the best of times, but 2026, who knows what's going to happen. So at least having some kind of like baked assumption in there so that when you get an unexpected spike in attrition at the end of Q1 because your bonus has been paid out and all of a sudden your competitor is filling their roles faster than you can fill yours, that you don't get left with a huge gap across the team. So I think that's where I would be starting to look as a TA leader and kind of building all the kind of good charts and reports that you would want in order to maintain the health of the recruiting function. So looking at burn down charts, looking at capacity by recruiter, looking at expected time to fill based on segmented role. So, an executive role is not going to get filled as quickly as an entry level sales role. And so understanding those pipelines, how you segment out and having that data kind of ready to go based on 2025 performance. So when you get to 2026, you're not kind of just going based on feel, you actually have the data to back it up and kind of tie everything back together. So you're being that kind of central point of contact. You're not the decision maker, but you are giving guidance that's going to help the decision makers to actually identify where their priorities are going to go, and then showing week by week, month by month, progress to goal and where the current priority queue lies. It's kind of, I like to think of it as, from my ops background, as kind of S&OP forecasting, where you actually have a forward-looking projection based on the demands of the business, and you can understand how the supply of recruiting capacity is actually going to fit into that. And as a TA leader, that's actually going to help you understand if you need more roles within your team. So if you need to add capacity to the recruiting team, it's going to take you 3 months to hire a good recruiter, then 3 months to onboard them, then 3 months to actually fill the role that you're hiring them for. So you actually really need that. We used to plan in 5-quarter cycles so that you're not just doing an annual budget and you're not just doing kind of a rolling kind of monthly forecast, but you're actually constantly looking 5 quarters ahead, understanding that the ability to forecast the further out you go is going to get less reliable, but at least having some data behind it so that you can change it as required. That was a bit of a monologue. It's something I'm quite passionate about, but curious how you've seen rolling forecasting work. And there are definitely downsides, and we can definitely go into those, but have you seen it work? Have you seen some challenges there?
No, well, there's 3 things immediately came to mind as you were talking. And as for the monologue, I hope that this is why, people are joining us to hear kind of like the deeper, longer form stuff. But we'll clip this, we'll clip all this into some things that maybe entice people to listen. But there's 3 things that you said that were interesting. So one, we're working with a customer who has headcount associated with sales, and the headcount can fluctuate like pretty large based on the size of the project or the size of the sale. And there's this hump that we had to overcome about the sale closes and the time to fill might make sense, but to get the recruiter to do that takes a little bit more time. So like having this, again, we're obviously here for a reason, but both of our solutions are about getting all of your data into one data set so that you can draw the regression line through demand to say like, okay, we might not need that extra recruiter right now, but because every Q4 we add XYZ roles, this is what I want to do. I won't make an offer till we know, but this is what I'd like to do. Headcount to kind of these conditional things in a rolling forecast is one. The other 2 main things that you brought up that I wanted to talk about is dynamic time to fill. Here in the US, at least, you have holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, Hanukkah are all falling in this Q4 region. And on top of that, depending on folks' fiscal year, although it is very common for bonuses to be tied to fiscal performance, and commissions in the Q4, depending on your industry, could be the bigger of the checks. And as you're navigating not only the time to identify a candidate and make an offer, you're also navigating the time for that person to quit their job and start anew. They might have contingent money put on. So, in a world where you want to buy people out to get them in sooner, that's a conversation, but you may also have to pay with time and wait for those folks to join. So that's the second thing. The third thing is unified prioritization. So the difficult thing that I experienced as a recruiter was, as a recruiter, I didn't have, I'm talking IC recruiter, I didn't have the authority to try to drive executive accountability about what they determined was high priority, which is why I was so adamant about including this high priority source of truth in headcount, is because the high priorities, it's a agreement of the business that limited resources need to focus on the highest return on investment from a hire, and the executive should be aligned about that. And so as a TA leader, as you navigate for chaos of finishing the plan, making next year's plan, and trying to get it all done with the resources that you have while advocating for future resources, managing the executive accountability for the prioritization or for the use of resources, and then driving to some sort of, cadence of accountability and update in a weekly exec meeting or a weekly email update, etc. Those are the things that, when I hear rolling forecast, I hear I need to be doing all of these things in real time on top of trying to figure out what's happening Q1, because that same idea of time to fill a notice period, I'm working on Q1 roles now. So you have to start giving them to me now so that I know what's going on.
Yeah, I think kind of touching on that, the concept I like to think about is it comes from military aviation, the OODA loop, the observe, orient, decide, act, and how quickly can you move through the pattern of reacting to new information and taking action based on that. And if you think about the way that the kind of business runs at a high level, there are different kind of market demands coming from the business. And I think of this example, I was working with a CTO, and the priority for the product roadmap changed 4 times within 1 quarter. And this was the quarter that they were running their planning cycle. And so every time the plan changed, they had to reprioritize all their recs. And so what that means is that even though the kind of CTO's OODA loop is kind of going through these steps, and maybe every 3 weeks the priority changes because he's reacting to new information that he's getting from the market, from his marketing department, from the sales department, to reprioritize where he needs to focus for the year. The recruiting team's doing the same thing. And so they're getting this reprioritized list of recs. And they're essentially having to start from zero again every time those recs get reprioritized. So the time to hire doesn't start from the first time that you set that budget. It starts from the last time that your final plan is locked in. And so if you're taking 3 months to actually go through that whole planning process, you can't expect them to have those hires in place the month after, because your recruiting is not starting until the end of it. So I think thinking about the time series of how all these things fit together, I like to think of it as like a supply chain where you get the different inputs at different stages, but there is a time delay in between each stage before you can kind of move to the next one. And so I think helping, as a TA leader, helping the business leaders to understand the constraints that recruiting are operating within, and how the change in demand from the business is actually going to impact when they expect to see the results from that, I think is going to be really important. And we touched on recruiting capacity briefly, but that's so important given that your roles are constantly reprioritized. And when the market's strong, recruiters become the most in demand roles. And so it's actually hard to hire and it's hard to keep good recruiters.
Say that again. The OODA loop? I'm not in the military, or haven't been. So that might be a new concept, but I really like the way that you kind of zip through it, but kind of break that down. Does it apply to a TA leader? And what is it again? OODA loop?
The OODA loop, yeah. So, so let's say in this example, this CTO changed the product line that they were going to focus on. So they had a top-down constraint within a budget. So they had a maximum amount they could spend across the team, and they had to deliver on market-leading products within the fiscal year. But that market-leading product that they were going to focus on changed 4 times before they settled on what that was going to be. But every time it changed, they then gave that signal back to the head of TA. So the head of TAs observed the signal that's coming in. Okay, these are the priority recs that I need. Orient, okay, how am I going to build the team based on what this actually means for the recruiting organization? Decide on actually how to actually implement that, and then actually act. So then go and execute on the recruiting process. But then if it takes 3 weeks to actually run through that whole loop, which is probably aggressive for like a good kind of fast turnaround and actually getting people in place, when you have to shut down recs, you have to disposition candidates potentially if you're then going to freeze these hiring programs, and then kind of re onboard to kind of new intake for a new rec. Like, you think of the cascade of all these impacts, and you kind of have these constant decision making loops that are going on within an organization. And I think quite often on the business side, I was definitely guilty of this when I was in the business, is you don't understand the impact that your decision making actually has on the supporting functions like recruiting. And so I think understanding that and making it clear to the business leaders what your OODA loop looks like, if you want to use that terminology, or your decision-making framework, or whatever civilian equivalent that would be, so that they can understand why it's important to get a solid plan, but also how you can remain flexible and maybe cut down on the cycle time that it takes you to go through that process, maybe with an agile recruiting plan, which seems to have become more popular, and not kind of having very clearly defined kind of roles where only one recruiter recruits for one type of role, but actually, we'll probably go into that in a much later podcast episode, where we think about more like agility across the team and responding to these plans. As far as rolling plans go, I think that's one of the danger. If you sell the plan as being somewhat flexible, then the people that are utilizing the plan are going to take advantage of that flexibility in ways that you may not have intended. And so you have to figure out, how do you actually respond to that, but actually make that, it's more of an education. How do you make them aware that even if they change their plan, it's actually not going to play out the way that they hope?
So yeah, blog post worthy. I think the OODA loop for TA leaders is important, and the way that we capture it, I didn't even think of it through that lens. Generally, I get the concept, right? So like in Headcount, we have this stat called recs that have changed while the recruiter is working on it. And I mean meaningful change, right? Like title, level, salary, start date. And what that essentially is counting is OODA loop resets, right? So how many times did you reset that, and who was the person doing it, right? Did it come from the business? Did it come from the hiring manager? Did it come from a planning session? All of these resets are what impact recruiting efficiency. And I think as a TA leader, we're used to being the lightning rod for things that aren't working out. I asked you to fill it, you didn't fill it. And if the funnel is your only defense, then the only answer is, well, the funnel didn't have enough volume. We didn't move people through. We didn't interview. It's not a true story of what's happening. And those delays, when you have them in a singular place, to our previous point, can be correlated to performance, right? So like, how many times did a decision change actually result in better quality or more production or more revenue? But also it helps you draw more accurate time to fill estimates, particularly in the Q4 period. And it helps you understand from an accountability perspective, like, where's the signal coming from, and how do we avoid that in the future or prepare for it? I think, one of the main things you don't want to do as a TA leader, especially as a service provider, I think TA is a very interesting case because of the perception of their operational ability and the majority of these like large enterprises. You don't want to be the yes, no. You want to be an informant, a partner to these groups, trying to help them get through some things. And so to that extent, like in a rolling forecast, there are pitfalls to a rolling forecast. There's things TA leaders should be aware of in Q4. Like, what are the things that TA leaders should be concerned about in Q4? And then how does that impact their finance counterpart?
Yeah, I think maybe if I could kind of just go like one level deeper on the kind of the metrics that we've just discussed. I think the time to fill has always been the metric that I like the most, because I think faster decision making actually solves a lot of the other problems. It reduces cost, it improves quality generally if you can close candidates faster than your competitors. But I think what we're talking about here with kind of constant changes of prioritization, and the impact that actually has on the recruiting team and on the funnels, actually impacts candidate experience. And generally, you're not going to see the impact of the candidate experience within one quarter or even like potentially one fiscal year. But over the long run, if you are constantly freezing hiring pipelines, you're not making offers, you're not getting back to candidates, you're going to develop a reputation for not being a great place. And so all of a sudden, when you do need to hire those roles, we'll use this kind of CTO example. If you all of a sudden decide that you don't need product managers, you need engineers. And so you switch off your product manager pipeline, even though you've already engaged and have a whole bunch of very good candidates in. in that process and you focus on engineering. When you then come back to hire those product managers, if they've had a terrible experience, then the likelihood that you're going to close the best candidates is much lower. It's really kind of the second order effects, the knock on impact of what does this do to kind of the experience and then employer brand and then quality of hire? Like how does that impact over the long run? So there's a point that's close to my heart. I came from customer experience in supply chains, actually seeing the impact of the experience that a customer has on long-term revenue potential is so key, and it applies directly with candidate experience and long-term ability to hire really good people, which is what everyone wants. So a bit of a kind of soapbox moment, but I feel quite passionately about that. But kind of going back into what are TA leaders doing? What are they doing going into Q4 planning? What do they need to make sure that they are not doing? And I'd say
Right.
that kind of the key thing is how do they get the seat at the table so that they don't get the rec list thrown over the wall on January 1st and expected to fill them by January 1st. How can they have that seat? And so that, to your point, they are not just saying yes or no, or potentially saying yes and then not meeting the demand, which is bad for everyone. It makes the TA leader look bad, like the team is underperforming. It makes the business underperform because they're planning to have certain roles, but actually to be involved in those conversations and speak the same language. So speak in terms of ROI of different roles, speak in terms of the kind of overall finance budget, in terms of the expected time to hire and what that's going to do to the business so that they can push for that prioritization list to actually match something that's realistic. And I think to have that seat at the table, you're not just granted it, it's something that's earned, and it's earned by bringing the leaders that are going to be sitting at that table the information they need ahead of time and having those relationships already built out. So if I'm a head of TA right now, I've probably already spent most of the year working with those people, but I'm probably bringing scenarios to them based on what I expect their FY26 plans are going to look like, and showing, if you decide to focus in this area, this is what we're seeing from the market. This is how hard it is to hire these kind of roles. This is the expected impact to your P&L because compensation is going to have to go up because of these factors. And so you're bringing business metrics from a recruiting lens that's going to help them to make better decisions. And then when you get invited to that table, you already understand the process. You already understand what everyone's looking for, and you're kind of speaking in words and in frameworks that the CFO understands. So when they say, okay, what is our budget going to be? How is it going to impact the business? The head of TA actually gets asked for their opinion. They don't just get given the kind of list of demands at the end. So that's where I've seen it work very well. And I've been fortunate to work with a lot of heads of TA who've come from the business and leadership roles in the business, and they have that credibility and seat at the table.
Yeah, I think a lot of themes. So as a comparison of rolling tops down, bottoms up, I think a lot of the TA themes are going to be kind of universal. Every business wants a intelligent input from TA about what is possible based on what has already happened, with additional information from the data that is collected about modifications or planning for scenarios, right? Like everybody wants that. And the TA leader's ability to deliver that is a function of, what type of process they run, what type of data they have, the quality of the recruiting team, the quality of the hiring manager, the quality of the planning process. But across all three types of planning styles, having that opinion at the table remains consistent. What I've seen in rolling forecasts is that there's less of a hard cutover as far as a TA leader is concerned. So whenever we do quarterly planning that will roll between 2025 and 26 or any fiscal year, it's not as much of a use it or lose it. And I kind of get my Q1 stuff a little bit earlier because the business doesn't stop trying to achieve its goals for 2025, set whole new goals for 2026. The headcount planning style kind of reflects the business's rolling production, rolling revenue, whatever the case may be. And so there's no real change business-wise from one fiscal year to the next. I see it more in non-public companies. I see it more in consumer brands. But the rolling forecast from a TA leader's perspective, yes, I'm going to have difficulty in getting people on prioritization. I'm going to have, people competing for limited resources. There's going to be a lot of analysis towards the end of the year that needs to inform other parts of the fiscal planning cycle that is going to detract from my recruiting capacity. Bottoms up and tops down have a little bit more of a cutover, right? You need to close out 2025, you need to bring it on to 2026. And then there's this process of migration, right? There's this what is coming from 25 to 26 or fiscal year 1 to fiscal year 2. And what gets lost. And for those hard cutover roles, I'm managing a lot of candidate experience for the same reason you mentioned about the OODA cycle of, in that engineering example. It's like, you open a rec and then, well, it's the end of the year, so we're not opening this rec anymore. It's a difficult conversation to have and an opportunity for TA leaders to kind of work on their talent pipeline for the following year. But nonetheless, like that's kind of as a TA leader, what I've seen between the different forecasts. The other main common thread is calibration. So, I've had my own experiences, calibrations in the big tech companies that I'd worked for in the past, and sometimes in the VC-backed, companies I supported via Unicorn, they can get pretty aggressive. What's your opinion on calibrations? How do you run one that, what's your opinion on calibration meetings? How does a TA leader participate? How do you make one that doesn't,
Yeah. So are we talking kind of calibration for internal employees, or are we talking calibration for the actual hiring pipeline and the kind of like the competencies you're going to be identifying within new hires?
It's more like, in any of these budgets, there's limited resources, right? The best scenario is you have so much money, everyone can hire everyone they want. That might be happening in some of the bigger AI companies right now. We'll see how that works out. But once you determine from bottoms up or tops down, like what the budget is or what the role requests are, there's a certain amount of things that are core and accepted. Then there's like, do we really need this? There's this calibration meeting of different departments saying, yes, I do really need this budget. Yes, I do need this role. It should be on my team. And balancing the executive requirements with what the business is able to provide, those calibration meetings can get wild. Have you had experience? I don't know if that is a uniquely, VC backed thing, but what's your experience with it? How do you make one that, like, what's a TA leader's responsibility? What can they provide to make sure that goes well?
Yeah, I think if you think about the type of data that the TA leader can bring to that discussion there, kind of looking at potentially market performance, potentially like what is the kind of like equivalent. If we go to market for this kind of role, what kind of performance are we expecting? How complicated it is to hire for that role? And that's additional context, which maybe is not going to be part of the primary discussion in the calibration meeting of, who is performing well, who's not performing well, who do we put on the PIP, do we exit 10% of the workforce and things like that. But I think adding that additional context is quite helpful. Where I've seen it actually work very well is this kind of concept called dynamic resource allocation. And I think there's a whole McKinsey suite of articles on this, which I think we'll try and put in the show notes. But I really like that approach because and if you think about each of the kind of words in it, it's dynamic resource allocation. What you're doing is not necessarily saying, do we have what is the performance of the people that we have in the role right now, but do we actually have the right roles in the business in order to build the organization that we need? So even if someone is a high performer, if they're in a role that's no longer relevant to the business, then you have to ask, what do we do with this person? Do we identify them for another role? Likewise, if you have someone who's an underperformer, but the role's critical, like how quickly can you replace that role if you then terminate that employee? And that's where I think TA can bring a lot of insight. They understand a kind of market penetration in different geographies or different talent pools. Like how easily would it be to replace that low performer, and how critical is it to the business? I think you're kind of building this matrix of kind of what is the most important, kind of going back to our prioritization of recs. And for some roles, you could be exiting pretty senior people, and having that TA leader understand what those kind of confidential requisitions are going to look like, how quickly they can action them, and then actually being that kind of like guide to think about timelines for how to actually turn over this role and make sure that we don't overly impact the business in a negative way by doing this. And so I think there's kind of like a bridge from kind of planning to reality that TA leader is going to give that operational lens for. And that's one of the things that I think TA especially brings to the table that you otherwise would probably miss if you're just saying, we're going to exit these 3 people. Let's prioritize these recs to backfill them as quickly as possible. If all of a sudden those recs are 6 to 9 months time to hires, and they're kind of business critical positions. I think there's kind of a lot to unpack that I would love to get into on a kind of a later episode, especially with dynamic resource allocation as it applies to headcount planning. But I think if you're considering tying calibration to your 2026 headcount plan, you really need to think first, what are the roles that we need in order to deliver the business that we want, as opposed to who do we currently have and how well are they performing. I think that's the second step. But if you don't have the right roles, it doesn't matter if you've got top performers, because you're not going to meet the business goals.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think when you're running a calibration, right? When you're in budget planning season for 2026 or the next fiscal year, and you are trying to calibrate on what do we actually add to the plan, you nailed it, right? I think the budget owners need to bring the ROI of net new hires, and that's going to come from some of the HR data about their performance or quality of hire. I think they need to understand their talent map so that they understand who's in a position to do that job today, and can we reorganize folks against the business demand so that the talent is mapped against demand. Your existing talent is mapped against demand. I think the TA leader can bring a recruiting capacity versus demand and performance about what's actually possible in the market. The compensation team can talk about cost changes as these roles are calibrated upon. And then the finance team is bringing the broader context of how hiring these combinations of roles impacts the financial performance of the business. One of the most common conversations that I've seen across my customers and others is, where do we hire based on cost and the productivity that is now unlocked with AI? So you can hire 20 people in one location or 10 people in another location for similar salary costs, but your finance person is trying to figure out, well, what is the ROI? And that ROI is speed to revenue produced, turnover, cost of office locations. You need a bigger office for 20 people. So there's all these different things that are happening in that meeting, which makes it such a beast of an exercise. But the idea that a talent leader can bring information from previous performance and distribute accountability for how prioritization or hiring timelines impact these desired financial goals. We talked about it last episode. Everything on paper looks great. I want to hire 10 people. Do you have enough people to interview those 10 people to even hire those 10 people, right? Bringing this information to say, here's your theory, here's what reality looks like, and it be credible, I think is the aspiration of a talent leader during the planning process.
Totally agree.
So I think, look, every model has something that works or doesn't work, has trade-offs and benefits, from top down being finance led and budget constrained to bottoms up being this like auction for budgets, or a rolling forecast that kind of maps the business. Each one brings something that is unique to the business. I think if you're a TA leader navigating each of these, you have different data that you could bring to the table, from your headcount plan, your workforce data, your historic recruiting performance, your ATS, so that these things go better. And it'll help you drive a better partnership with your FP&A team. And then you'll really be in sync with your workforce planning team about how do we map the talent, whether they work here or they will work here, against what the business is demanding. What's final thoughts with Chris Mannion on headcount planning styles, right? What do you want everyone to walk away with from your perspective, and how should we close out this episode?
Yeah, I think kind of going in, you're not going to be tied to just one headcount plan, hopefully. I think, finance is going to be in the room. They're going to have their opinion based on what the budget looks like for the coming year. Business leaders are going to have their opinion based on a bottoms-up analysis of what they think they need in order to deliver the goals. TA should be at the table explaining how feasible it is to achieve different hiring plans based on what's projected going forward, but actually layering in that rolling forecast and understanding on a month-to-month basis how you're tracking to goals, so you can get early indication if you need to adjust course, you need to pull back on recs, and maybe you need to kind of freeze recs for a month in order to ensure that you kind of stay close, is much better than having kind of huge hiring spikes or big kind of layoffs or restructuring processes. So I think understanding the way you can use each of those different approaches, understanding the data that you need to take to the table, and then really just having a very productive conversation that's two-way, and you're not just kind of taking the tickets as a TA leader, but actually really driving the conversation. I think it's going to be key.
Yeah, agreed. Well, I think it's the best episode we've ever recorded. The audio is definitely better for anyone paying attention, but I'm excited to continue the conversation. We should probably do some of these live, take some questions from folks going through it. I'm doing a couple of webinars in the next couple weeks for the employee community, for the Ashby community, of like Q&A about how to start doing some of these processes in the future. So I think we owe it to the listeners to do one for them. So we'll, like I said, open up the Headcount Experts page for you to submit questions or participate in events in the future. But until the next one, this was episode 2, Styles of Headcount Planning. Looking forward to episode 3.
Awesome. See you there.
All right. Thanks, Chris.